everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Comic Corner. Today, I am your host, TJ, aka Fat Thor, and I am joined by a very special guest. You may know him as the writer of the recent When the Blood Has Dried from MadCave Studios. Today, I welcome Gary Moloney to the show. Gary, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. This corner is very comfy. I didn't realize you had these nice chairs and everything, and the fancy coffee. I feel very privileged.
Hey man, we like to make our guests comfortable here in the Comic Corner. It's a little comic nook, if you would, where we get to nerd out and be comfy and, like you said, drink our great coffee. But I cannot be more excited to have you here today, my friend. I had the absolute pleasure of checking out When the Blood Has Dried. You were so kind enough to send it over to me, and I absolutely love this book. Like I talk about comics every single week. I read a lot of comics every week, and I like this book. I absolutely loved. I thought like the way that you guys did it was super creative, so well done, and it wraps itself up so beautifully. So before we get into the book, I just want to praise how much I really enjoyed this book.
Oh no, I appreciate that, man, and like it really warms my heart to hear you say that. I mean, the whole team, myself, Daniel Romero, Becca Carey, our letterer, and James Emmett, our editor, like we've really put our heart and soul into that book over the last couple of years. And of course, Marco Rudy, our cover artist, who just like brings his A game every single time. But like it's really been a labor of love for the last couple of years, particularly for me and Daniel, it being our kind of first book in the direct market. So to have people like you say that you really dug it, and because I know that you read so many books and that it's connected with you. No, that's the highest praise. Like I'm going to go off on a high after this interview, to be honest.
Good, man. That's part of my job. Make sure you leave here on a good high note and as excited as I am about your work. Because, like I said, I'm not just gassing you up because you're in front of me. I really enjoyed this book. I am a huge fantasy nerd, so like this just ticked all the boxes for me. But before we get deep and nerdy into When the Blood Has Dried, I want to take it back just a little bit. Something we typically do on this show is kind of back up. But we typically do a kind of comic origin story, how you got into the medium, all that kind of good stuff. So I want to ask you, obviously, not only how did you get into comic books, what kind of books really got you into the medium, but I also wanted to ask you, because I know that you are in Ireland, and I know that we in the States are in a lot of places kind of very fortunate and spoiled with having comic shops very near to us. And my co-host over on my other channel, Sons of Milner, he's actually from Ireland, and I know that he has to travel quite a ways to get to his comic shop. So I also wanted to ask you, growing up in a place where maybe a comic shop wasn't as close by, what that kind of experience was like having access to books.
No, definitely, and they're right about that. It's a very different experience growing up as a comic reader or someone who's interested in comics in Ireland, as compared to what it would be like in the States or even in places like the UK or elsewhere. So, like when it came to how I got into comics and all of that, like I was a child in the '90s, so I grew up at a really kind of peak time when it came for other media involving comic book characters and comic book heroes. So I was at the right age as Batman the Animated Series is coming out, X-Men, Spider-Man in particular was probably the animated series I was most, enamored with at the time.
That
That
was
would be one of my
my
favorite.
show, dude. Hell yeah.
I mean, when I read Peter Parker to this day, it's the guy from the '90s show I hear in my head as I'm reading it. But
It
like
is
all those
so
things.
funny. Oh, I'm
Go
sorry.
on. No, go on.
I was just gonna say it's so funny that you say that, because literally last night, for I don't know what reason, I haven't read Spider-Man in years, and I was reading just like some classic Ditko Stan Lee stuff, and exactly what you just said. I hear that guy's voice, the guy from the animated series, like that is the voice that I hear when I read Spider-Man. So it's just funny that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people still say that they hear Kevin Conroy when they read Batman, but like for me, it's the guy from the Spider-Man, the '90s series, and so like I would have been very familiar with comic book characters, but access to comics as a medium themselves, they were more limited in Ireland growing up. So like you would have newsstands or news agents in the same way that you'd have in the States, but you wouldn't have the same selection. You couldn't get every single comic book ever. You were very, you're very restricted. And a lot of times it was limited to stuff from the UK. And what I mean by that is it would be an awful lot of humor comics. So things like the Dandy and the Beano, which are really kind of, gag strips, 2-3 pagers, Dennis the Menace style thing. The other Dennis the Menace. There's the American Dennis the Menace, and then there's the UK Dennis the Menace. So it would be a lot of that, and that would be kind of the bulk of a lot of what you'd see. You then have like kids tie-in comics. So like there would be like, Turtles had a tie-in comic and all of that. The one I kind of grew up on and had a lot of affection for and still do was a book called Sonic the Comic, which wasn't the Archie series reprinted. It was a Sonic the Hedgehog book that was inspired directly from the games and kind of took a lot of its hints from the games and kind of created this almost strange baby's first dystopia storyline, and really kind of came with the readers and approached them, in the way that they'd like to be spoken to. It didn't talk down to its readership, and it kind of dealt with a lot of, interesting themes. And it's funny, like you talk to a lot of comic creators from Ireland, the UK of my age. A lot of them will point to Sonic the Comic as being, one of their first real comics, because that was the first comic I remember actually collecting or actually wanting to collect on a regular basis. So it was often structured as well, where they would be like 4 or 5 different stories. The first story would always be Sonic, and that would be the longest one. But then you'd have a Knuckles strip, a Tails strip, an Amy Rose strip, things like that. And it also had over the time had different Sega characters guest starring. So there was a Streets of Rage strip in that, written by Mark Miller of all people, and other kind of series like that. Golden Axe had its due. So that was one that I really, really enjoyed and would have been the one I was kind of most regularly buying at the time. They did, in Ireland, kind of there was UK reprints of a lot of Marvel stuff as well. So they would kind of collect 3 issues of the Amazing Spider-Man and bundle them together in a single book and sell you that every month. It would always be like 2 years behind or something. So you were getting like the Clone Saga, but 2 years behind. But I didn't really have a lot of exposure to that stuff until the Spider-Man movie came out in 2002, and suddenly there was a big push for all the different Marvel stuff. So, characters who I really only understood as cartoon characters, who I'd only experienced through the animated series, suddenly they're pushing like crazy in the newsagents. So not only do you have Astonishing Spider-Man, which was reprinting the JMS Spider-Man run, but also they start bringing out and pushing Ultimate Spider-Man, the reprints of the Mark Begley and Brian Michael Bendis initial run. And so that's really when I start reading comics, American comics, on a regular basis. At that same time as well, Sonic the Comic is wrapping up its run, and so suddenly that's my new in for comics, is reading the Spider-Man reprints. Let's say I've got this brilliant 2-hander of one of the best Amazing Spider-Man runs with one of the best Spider-Man runs, hands down, in Ultimate Spider-Man. And that really is my in for reading comics. And from there, I go on to read the Chuck Dixon Nightwing run. And I go on to read X-Men and Wolverine and Deadpool and things like that. And that's really how I got into comics, starting with the kind of the animated series stuff and then moving from there into regular comics and starting in the newsagents, and then eventually getting out to one of the few comic shops, proper, when we speak of comic shops, we mean old school Wednesday Warrior style comic shops. And I was lucky enough that I lived in the city in Cork, and there was one comic shop, Other Realms, there. It's unfortunately closed now in the last couple of years, but that was there, and so I had access to that stuff too. So I was able to get trade paperbacks, I was able to get back issues, I was able to go in for free comic book day. But all that stuff kind of turned me into a comic reader slowly over time.
I love that so much, and I especially love it too because I find, again, for us in the States, a lot of people, but it's like Marvel DC is huge, and we have very easy access. So, a lot of people start off their comic journey, we have a tally going on our other show of all the creators that shout out X-Men as like one of their first books. It's like almost always X-Men. But I really love when I hear from a creator that they got in from like more indie style comics or, not from the big two. Because to me, that just shows like you really like love the medium and like you found it despite like I said, not having the big two so readily available. So I absolutely love that. And also, I mean, Ultimate Spider-Man for me was so fundamental. I mean, it was like I was like the perfect age when that came out. And so having that be one of the titles that got you into Marvel books, I think is absolutely amazing. I think a lot of people can relate to that. But I
I mean, don't get me
also,
wrong. I had my Wolverine, time as much as everyone else.
mhm.
That was like
Oh yeah.
after that, it went to Wolverine, particularly as
Mhm.
the second X-Men movie came out. And what they did for us is that they packaged, like they were packaging the Spider-Man series together, they packaged Wolverine and Deadpool together. So you got 2 issues of Wolverine and 1 issue of
Oh.
Deadpool. So I was in there long before Ryan Reynolds was mixing the two into a movie.
I would say he's copying you, dude. That's
Mm-hmm.
crazy though. That even back then, I know obviously they have a history in the comics, but it's crazy that they were selling them like bound together even back then. And now, fast forward 15 whatever years later. I mean, you could call this the year of Deadpool and Wolverine. They're freaking everywhere, comics, movies, anywhere you look. But I wanted to also ask you, like I said, I'm a huge fantasy nerd. And obviously mythology. I'm known as Fat Thor. And I wanted to ask you kind of your fantasy origin, if you would, like how you kind of got into the genre of fantasy. And I also kind of want to ask you uh kind of about mythology a little bit. I know that some of your early work is some mythology anthologies and kind of mixing them with different genres. And please correct me if I'm wrong and misunderstanding this, but from my understanding, I've heard and what I know of like Irish mythology is it's a lot more based on like folk legends and like folk tales, like things of that nature. So I just am curious, like I said, again, kind of how you got into the genre of fantasy and like leveraging Irish mythology in some of your stories, which we'll get more into when we get into the books, but just kind of broadly.
Yeah, of course. So, like, when it came to fantasy, again, I'm kind of a product of the time I grew up in because, as a kid of the 90s, it's hard to have grown up at that time and, not have had a love of high fantasy that's directly kind of tied to the Lord of the Rings because I was just the right age when I would have been about 7 or 8 as the Lord of the Rings movies are coming out in theaters for the first time. So I'm being brought and exposed to them, as this new exciting thing. Like I never had been given, say, a copy of the Lord of the Rings before that, but I have this distinct memory of being brought to see the Fellowship of the Ring in 2001. Was that I think 2001 or whatever year it was, and being brought by my dad, and like he's like, look, you're not going to. This isn't like something you've seen before. This is going to be your first time experiencing something like this. This is going to be a long movie. It's probably the longest movie you're ever going to see. And just tell me what you think about it. Just go in with an open mind. And I remember being blown away. I remember being blown away by like this, the epicness of it all, the fight scenes, the characters, and like I remember coming to the end of the movie going, they haven't delivered the ring to Mordor. What's going on? Why is the credits rolling? Dad is like, well, you see, there's actually 2 more movies coming out. There's actually 2 more books. Here are the books. So he kind of set me up, being like, oh, you like that? Do you like high fantasy? Well, here's the rest of it. So I kind of came in at that point. I came in as someone who really really loved the Lord of the Rings movies. From there, went on to the books. At the same time, Games Workshop started publishing a miniatures war game, battle game for tie into Lord of the Rings that they were kind of releasing in. They obviously had the big boxes, and if you went into a Games Workshop store, you'd be able to buy the big boxes too. But they were also releasing it as part of a magazine where every 2 weeks you'd get a new set of models, paints. They give you step-by-step guides of how to paint them. So that all kind of mixed together to really get me into fantasy. And because the Lord of the Rings movies were so successful, there was this kind of renaissance of high fantasy material in general. Suddenly, everyone and their aunt was writing a high fantasy series or publishing an epic fantasy book. And so I was absorbing all of that because I was like, okay, I like Lord of the Rings, so I love all this stuff too. And I read a lot of that stuff. I read Brian Jax's Redwall books as well, and a lot of different things like that. And I really, really enjoyed that for kind of a long, long time. And that was really kind of my in for high fantasy. Over time, my taste in fantasy developed. I became more a fan of urban fantasy and things like the Dresden Files. But I'd always keep a hand in epic fantasy. And when a cool new series came along, or an author that was really speaking to people like Joe Abercrombie. Joe Abercrombie is one of my favorite fantasy authors, and there's a lot of that DNA in the When the Blood Has Dried. But it was always from the release of the Lord of the Rings, there was always a part of me that was interested in high fantasy, interested in epic fantasy. I played the video games, I'd play with the models, the whole shebang. So that's the kind of the high fantasy side of things. For the mythology side of things, you're right about Irish fantasy or Irish mythology. It's a bit different from, say, other mythology or other folklore, in that, say, as you know from your namesake, Norse mythology has the Poetic Eddas or the Prose Edda. It has a rich kind of written tradition of recording its mythology. And there's a lot of spoken and written about the fact that a lot of it is missing. So you kind of have to fill in the gaps a lot. Or there are certain figures that we only know exist because they're referenced in other stories, and so their full history or their full meaning is unknown. But Irish mythology is very much based on what we call the oral tradition. Bailitis in Irish, this idea of coming around the campfire, coming around storytellers. We're often described as a nation of storytellers and stuff. That's because we pass down a lot of our traditions, our stories, our songs, our poems orally. There wouldn't be that tradition of, say, like a lot of recording a lot of this stuff in writing, which created a big problem, particularly in the early 1900s, when a lot of the people who would be custodians of this tradition and custodians of those oral tales and oral folklore and things like that started dying out. And people realize, oh, I never actually fully remembered or took to memory that story. And so there was an awful lot of effort to try to have these stories, these poems, these songs recorded for posterity and things like that. But there is within that, say, a very distinct, set of mythological cycles. There's different traditions, different sets of stories that exist within Irish mythology, often based on what part of the country you're in. There's like the Ulster stories, the Connacht stories, and things like that have different protagonists, different characters that show up. Fionn McCool will be in one part of the country, whereas Cú Chulainn, which is some that people may have heard, your listeners may have heard of, if only because Will Slimey did a graphic novel about them. And so there's all these different characters, but it's mainly kind of an oral tradition. And what has been recorded is often recorded by other people. And it's very interesting to see that some of the earliest recordings or the earliest kind of written records of these legends come from people from the UK who are coming over and were recording these things and these stories from having spoken to the local storyteller or the local Shanachie, as we would call them.
That's so awesome. Like I said, I'm obviously a big mythology nerd, and I love learning about different mythologies and all that. And like I said, I know that that is a huge part of your work, and again, especially your early work. So all of this, interest in comics, interest in fantasy, all this leads to about around 2017, 2018. You decide that you want to do comics like full time. You want to take the plunge, the thing that a lot of people want to do but never actually get themselves to do. You decided that you were going to do it, and to do that, you said that you committed yourself to making comics by every month you released a 4-page short story. And so every month you would try to find an artist or maybe a recurring artist, and you would just put out a short story every single month. And this all culminated into your first book called Mixtape. And so I want to ask you again, I feel like, all of us that are nerds, I think, have all thought like, oh, I could write a comic. Oh, I would love to be a comic writer. But most of, like, 90% of us never actually take that step, whether it be, self-doubt or feeling like you don't know how to get into the industry. But you did take that plunge. So I want to ask you, during this period when you dedicated yourself to comics, really dedicated to learning the craft, what were some of the early steps you took to really get the ball moving in your kind of comics education, if you would, and some of the things that, like, I guess you could say, surprised you about the process of making comics, like when you were learning about all this?
Yeah, so I'd always, had an interest in writing comics because, like you said, if you're, it's one of those few mediums where, everyone thinks they can do it. Anyone who's read a comic thinks, oh yeah, I could write one of those. And as much as people say, oh yeah, I could write a novel or they could write a book, I think a lot of them understand inherently that they can't. Whereas I don't think that's the case in comics to an extent. But I suppose the starting point of it was that I'd always been writing in some shape or form. I was always, telling stories. Some might say I was telling lies. Other people say I was telling stories. But I was always telling stories. I was always, looking to write stories, write poems. If there's any opportunities in class or in school to, take that creative route rather than doing something else, I would. I entered short story competitions and all of that. And then in 2008, my local library in Cork did something really, really cool. And it's a project that they're still doing. Geez, 16 years later. I'm old. But like it's... but what they did is they started what they called the Cork Graphic Novel Project. And what they did was that they got a professional writer, not always a writer who had experience in comics, but often they had some experience with it, and a professional artist. And they took a group of 15, 16-year-olds from the county. You had to apply for it. There was a kind of a competitive process for it. But they would essentially bring a group of them together and say, okay, we're going to do a number of workshops with you, and we will pair you up with artists. You will write a 4-page comic, and at the end of that process, we will publish that comic. And so they've been doing that every single year since 2008. So the first time, in 2008, that was the first time that comics were demystified in some way, because I finally got to see, what does a script look like? What does a comic script look like? And I remember the guy we were working with brought in a script excerpt from JSA or something like that. And it suddenly started to click. It's like, oh, that's how you do it. And you don't, as a writer, you don't always have to be the person who's drawing as well. Because as much as I had tried my hands at making comics before that, as much as I knew that there is someone labeled as writer, there is someone labeled as artist on the comics, it always seemed to me, oh, it's one person doing the two. If you want to do comics, you have to draw comics as well. But that was when I kind of really realized, oh, no, that doesn't have to be the case. You can solely be a writer, and this is how you do it. And this is the blueprint that you would use to do that. So I had that experience, and having had that experience, having put together a 4-page comic, which, isn't great, but no one's first comic is. But I suddenly knew the process. I knew what went into it, at least on some level. Still didn't have the full picture, but I had a good idea. And after that, I wanted to try to take opportunities to develop my craft, develop my writing skills. I started doing some work when I was in college then for various comic websites. So I worked with Monkeys Fighting Robots for a while, and Comic Buzz, doing op-ed pieces of reviews, really to kind of look at comics as a whole and look at what makes a comic work, and kind of deconstruct them on that basis. Kind of reverse engineer what makes a comic work and what doesn't make it work. So I spent a couple of years doing that, but it was always kind of the back of my mind that I'm doing this, yes, because it's good in and of itself, and it's good writing practice in and of itself, but also this will help me at some point when I finally have the resources and the ability to put together a comic. Because that was always kind of a blocking point as well, or kind of a barrier on some level, in that there was a local comic creating group in Cork that I would go along to and attend, and they had an annual anthology that they put out, and they had pitches for that, and I would try to submit stuff for that. But I also knew at the end of the day that if you want to make comics, you have if you don't just go up to Marvel's doors and knock on the door and hope that they'll give you a short story. You have to make your own comics. You actually have to put yourself out there. But as the writer, that means you're financing it and that you're going to be the project manager. So I finally had the ability to do that after college when I got my first job in 2017. So I finally had disposable income to be able to actually pay an artist. And there was an element of, well, you spend so long talking about what makes a good comic or what doesn't make a good comic. It's about time you put your money where your mouth was. and it's about time you can show that you can actually do it. And that's where the challenge you mentioned of, okay, I'm going to do a short story every month. And the reason I chose 4 pages of one, I thought it was manageable to be able to do a 4 pager in that time. It's something that was manageable from my perspective. I could afford to get it drawn and get it lettered. But it was also the format that 2000 AD, the guys who do Judge Dredd, are looking for when they're looking for new writers. They do what's called a future shock, which is a Twilight Zone style story, a science fiction story with a twist at the end. And those are very strictly 4 pages. So it was, okay, I'll get it done. I'm more likely to get it done and get it finished when it's 4 pages. And whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, at least I'll learn from having gotten it done. But also I'll be practicing for a format that potentially I could be pitching for down the line. In terms of things that I learned or how I kind of improved during that time, obviously by the fact that I was putting stuff out there, I was getting feedback on it the entire time, and it might be well received. People might have critiques of that, and you take those on board. But I also, during that time, took 2 classes. I took 2 classes with the Irish Writers Centre. One, and they were both on creating comics. One was with PJ Holden, who was an artist who's probably best known for his work on Judge Dredd, but his work for Marvel and DC as well. And he very much helped me, because being an artist first and foremost, he came out and was like, okay, here's what you need to know as a writer to be able to write effectively for artists, and what artists needs and what artists don't need. But he also gave me very, very invaluable advice, which I tell to every new writer who comes to me looking for advice, is that if you're going to spend money on a comic, spend it on a letterer, because it was his experience that people who were starting out, or people in small press comics, often overlooked the importance of lettering and wouldn't understand that if people were reacting negatively to their comic, that sometimes it came down to just whether the lettering worked or not. Because it's one of those things where a lot of people say it's meant to be invisible, so you should just be able to read it and go through. But it's also the case that bad lettering can pull you out of the experience. And rather than chalking that up to, oh, it's just bad lettering, they will say, oh, the art is off, or the writing is off, when it might have nothing to do with either. It might just be that the lettering doesn't work with the art, or it's not in line with the rules of lettering. So that was a very, very useful experience. And then I also did one with Declan Shalvey towards the end of that year. So kind of at the start of making the short stories that became Mixtape, I did the class with PJ. And then towards the end, I did a class with Declan. And that was very, very helpful in terms of fine-tuning a lot of those skills I developed over the year.
That is so cool, dude. And I really appreciate too, I feel like, for whatever reason, as a poet, which I think is it's a little bit across the board, but for books, or I don't know, other types of writing, I feel like some people, for whatever reason, think comics are in its own category and are easier than, say, writing novels or something. And so people will jump into comics thinking it's easier, and not realizing what it really takes to execute a good comic book. So I always love and really appreciate when people actually come into the medium with respect of it, and really dedicating themselves to learning how to put a book together. It's not just slapping a story over some art, right? There's a lot of things that go into it. And I also really love just hearing about, again, some of the things you have to learn. Again, it's you think, oh, I write a script, give it off to the artist, and bing, bang, boom, you got a page. But like you said, there's a lot of nuance in writing for that artist, making sure your ideas are clear for the artist. And, we talk about all the time, letterers are the unsung hero of comics in general. And there's kind of a famous saying in the comics community: if lettering is good, you'll never notice it, but if it's bad, it's the first thing you'll notice. And I think that is 100% true. So again, just learn. I think those are the type of things you can only learn if you really dedicate yourself to it. So I love that story so much, and all of that. So that you learn all this stuff, you hone your craft, kind of sharpen your blades, and that all leads us to When the Blood Has Dried. And speaking of artists and collaborators to do that, you hooked up with Daniel Romero and Becca Carey on lettering, which, I mean, I know we're here to talk to you today, but I got to shout out both of them. Absolutely fantastic work. I know you've talked a lot about how this book is a true collaborative effort between all of you guys. So, I mean, you guys are just working in perfect sync on this book. And like I said, I've already sung how much I loved this book. But one thing I want to ask you is, so, like, in my opinion, this book is like so cinematic. Like, the transitions from scene to scene flow so well, and especially in your cold opens and in your first issue, which this is something I absolutely loved. And I feel like, I mean, I'm sure comics have done this before, but something you don't see very often, and I really enjoyed. But you have like the credits almost like you would in a movie. Like, it's like the one panel has your name, next panel will have, you know, Daniel's name, and but it still flows with the story. So as opposed to having like an editorial page that kind of just has all the names on it and like editor and all that, it's linked with the cold open, which I thought that was just so cool and creative. So I got to ask, you know, before getting into some of the characters and the world building, how you guys kind of conceptualize that pacing for the book. And that's something I think that translates throughout all 5 issues, is the pacing of it is absolutely phenomenal. Again, how you open, how you close, and even the kind of not dull, but slower moments throughout the issue, it just all works so perfectly. So again, how did you guys land on like deciding the pacing of this issue, how to open, how to close it?
Well, I'm glad first off that first page and the idea of it almost being like the credits in movie worked for you, because that's exactly what we were going for. And it's something that I think, as you talk about it being cinematic, that's something that Daniel is very, very good at. So Daniel is, you know, someone who I've worked with from the very early days of comics. So like Daniel is in Mixtape. Daniel is one of the very first, you know, artists I worked with, you know, when I was doing, and when, you know, starting off with, you know, work I was doing with Limit Break Comics and going from there. Like, Daniel was one of the first people I started, you know, collaborating with, and he's always kind of had that sense to him. And I think because he comes from an animation background, when it comes to character art work, when it comes to how to set up the scene, he just has this intuitive idea of, you know, how to do it. But as for like the pacing generally and how we kind of approached it, one of the things, so obviously When the Blood Has Dried, you know, it's a high fantasy book, but it's also a spaghetti western book. It's about mixing those two kind of tonal genres, and it's about this character Maeve, who was an adventurer, was a gunslinger in the parlance of, you know, of the western, had a life of violence, and then is trying to get out of that, and has managed to escape, you know, when we first meet her. But of course, you know, that old life comes knocking on the door again. And a lot of those spaghetti westerns, the likes of, you know, Unforgiven, Shane, things like that, they have a certain cadence, there's a certain pacing to it. So it was about trying to replicate that feel. And even like in terms of like comics that, or in terms of other kind of media that, you know, influenced or had a role in that, like Logan was actually one that, you know, when I was first coming up with this idea, that had just come out. You know, so that was kind of, you know, in the back of my mind. So for me, pacing, I think, is so important in comic, and it's one that's kind of hard. It's hard to do because, unlike say in a lot of other mediums, pacing is also set by the reader, in that, you know, you can choose to stay on a page as long as you want, or you can flick through it as quick as you want. So how you as the creators present the story is all about trying to control that. So for example, you talk about the very first page of the book, where we have those credits where each, you know, person gets their credit on a different panel. That's to slow you down, because otherwise it's a silent page. There's no dialogue, there's no action happening in that page. But we want to slow you down. We really want you to take in every single part of what's happening on this page. So we slow you down with my credit, Daniel's credit, Becca's credit, before title reveal. And it brings you along with that. And a lot of times when it comes to pacing in comics, and when it comes to making comics in general, I equate it to a bit like poetry or music, or like writing music or writing poetry, in that there's often a meter to poetry or a meter to songs, and so they have a certain rhythm, they have a certain rhyme, and if that's off, if there's a beat on the wrong note, or if the meter is off by a thing, it and you feel it. So a lot of the time, the very early work from the writing side of things is I do all my first drafts longhand in notebooks, and it's trying to figure out the right balance of words to each panel. Sometimes we have a lot of silent scenes in this book because we want you to take it in, and then there's other scenes we want to slow you down even more, so we might add more dialogue or add uh, more conversations to it, and a lot. But again, everything has to have the right cadence, the right rhythm, and so it's about figuring out, okay, is there too much dialogue on this panel? Is there not enough dialogue? Are we moving the reader along too quickly, or are we not leaving them there? Are we leaving them there too long? And so a lot of that's kind of roughed out in those early kind of drafts, and then we send it over to Daniel. Daniel and I, while we have a very active relationship in terms of the actual process, in terms of what we're going for, and a lot of my scripts are about communicating to Daniel the feel of a page, the mood of a scene, what we're trying to achieve, and particularly for, say, characters, what are they feeling in that moment? What are the things that the character needs to know, and Daniel needs to know to be able to portray how they're actually feeling, but that the reader doesn't necessarily need to know or need to be made express. But by the time it gets to the page, by the time Daniel draws that character, feeling that way, they don't need to say anything. That Daniel captures it in that moment. And so by communicating that feel, by communicating that mood, it helps with the pacing as well, because Daniel knows if this is an action scene, it has to be a bit high octane. If this is a scene where we're trying to show you Maeve being introspective, or any of the other characters, taking a moment to consider things, we want to slow you down, and so the art reflects that too. So it's like everything in comics. It's constant communication, it's constant collaboration, but that's how we kind of do it, between working through it rough from my side of things, and then having in the script, having a conversation, and obviously Daniel and I will talk outside of the script too if he wants to clarify something, but about communicating that intent and that purpose, and then that will impact pacing as well.
That is so fascinating. I've never heard it like broken down, like you say, like in a meter kind of sense, like music or poetry, but it absolutely makes sense. And the nerd in me just loves that. Like, you took the time to, like you said, write it out so you can visually see like how the cadence of the words play together. I think that's just so, so cool. And again, something I really appreciate about the book, and I think is something that a lot of writers would be kind of scared or hesitant to do, is, like I said, you guys aren't afraid to take your time in this book. And there's many scenes, like you said, that have no dialogue, but they work just like so. I really think like those are my favorite parts of the book. Like in the first issue, we have just a whole page of Mabe like cleaning a glass and like pouring a drink, or the one where she goes fishing, and it just, like I said, it's like taking a breath during the like whole story of everything. And I think that that's something some writers would be a little afraid of, but again, you execute it so well, and it's again one of my favorite parts of all 5 issues. And again, I think it really hinges on Daniel's art is just so great. His backgrounds are so clean and crisp, like almost like animated, it seems like the backgrounds are. And the one thing which again I think really sells these again like the more introspective moments are his character acting is phenomenal. Like you can tell, like you were just saying, a lot of the notes you give him is like the feeling of the scene, and he is able to portray that in the characters' faces so well. And I heard you talk about a lot of that kind of the more introspective stuff was actually inspired like things like Cowboy Bebop and stuff like that. So can you just talk a little again? That's just one of my favorite parts of the book. So can you just talk a little bit more about again the collaboration with Daniel for the scenes that don't have dialogue and again portraying that kind of mood?
Yeah, I mean, you're dead right there. Like stuff like Cowboy Bebop is a big inspiration for the feel or the mood of a lot of those scenes. I think it comes from both Daniel and I being very big readers of manga and fans of anime in general. Where because and it's difficult because as much as they're the same medium in terms of they're both comics, right? They are very different storytelling formats. A manga will go on for hundreds of chapters, whereas US format comics, you have 20 pages, and you're lucky if you get 5-6 issues before you have to finish, either because that's the run you got, or because you're cancelled, or whatever. So, in American comics, it's very, very difficult to carve out that breathing space. But for the story and the tone of the story you wanted to tell, this is a character study. This is a drama. And those drama and stories like that only work if you care about the characters. And a lot of the time, the only way you're going to get to care about the characters if you spend, those intimate moments with them. I mean, what works so well for Cowboy Bebop is like the scenes you remember most. Yes, you remember the excellent fight scenes with Vicious, or you remember, like anything that can happen in the high octane action stuff. And you remember the music. But a lot of times, the things you think about when you think about Cowboy Bebop is the crew on the ship, in between missions, having a cigarette, or reflecting on the mission they just had, and letting that sit with them for a moment, because that's what gives it impact. That's what makes it something that you care about, and it's what makes you care for them. Is that you have seen them in these moments when they're at their most vulnerable, when they're at their most conflicted about what's happened, and that's what we do with Maeve or any of the characters in When the Blood is Dry. That's what we do where in issue 2, as you say, having just discovered that the guild, this band of mercenaries masquerading as heroes that she was part of, that they're in town, she hasn't dealt well with it, and she needs time to decompress and to really reckon with that. So she goes fishing. And in that scene, it's completely silent other than the splash of the fishing lure in the water. And it was about giving you that chance to really sit with Maeve and understand her and to feel what she's going through. And so that when I was writing the script for a page like that for Daniel, it was all about saying, okay, this is someone who has tried so hard to escape this life, thought they were out, and now everything that they've worked towards for 5 years, this new life they've built, this peaceful life, this community, this home she has now gotten for herself, all that is at risk. It could be taken away in an instant by these people. And she has to figure out how to deal with that. Does she stay? Does she run? Does she give up? Does she fight? How would being in that position make someone feel? And, there's all this chat about, you see on Twitter every now and then, like, oh, who's the director in a comic, or who's the cinematographer in a comic? But in that sense, it's more like, a director giving an actor notes, so like, here's where you are, here's your motivation. And so a lot of that, because I know I can trust, Daniel is amazing. Daniel's a fantastic artist, and we've worked enough together that there's a trust there. So I know he's going to deliver on the important bits, and unless there's something that needs to be in the scene for Chekhov's gun purposes, I don't need to explain to him what's hanging on the wall in the background. He'll get that. He knows that. We've done enough prep, development work on the series for him to know what the lock-in looks like. But in that moment, what he needs to know is like, hey, what are we trying to achieve in this scene? What's the feeling we want to invoke in the reader? And what is Maeve thinking? Because that's what allows him to do his best work. And so that's what we do in those kind of scenes.
That's so awesome. Like I said, I really think that those moments are my favorite in the entire series. And I think
Me too.
exactly what you're saying. It really just builds that relationship with the character. And again, it just all adds to the pacing of the book, which I think it's like one of those books that fits in a very niche section where it works incredible as issue by issue, because you leave it on like great cliffhangers and you open it up on the great kind of cold open, but it also works so well as a binge. Like when everyone out there listening and watching this, obviously I urge you to go out and pick up each issue individually, but when the trade comes, I think it's going to be fantastic in a trade, because again, the way the pacing works, it like I couldn't put it down. I kept wanting it, like you said, almost like a TV show or something. Like I have to see the next episode, right? And so I just love, I could just hear you talk about the process of, developing the book all day. But I got to ask you too. So something, again, I'm a huge fantasy nerd, and something that always interests me when I talk to people who write fantasy is their kind of world building process. And I've usually find, which obviously there's a lot of different examples you can use, but the one that I kind of mainly use is I usually kind of separate it into like the Tolkien and the George R.R. Martin, right? In the sense of, Tolkien knew every single corner of Middle, or like down to the blades of grass, and like, every name had a meaning, every place had, everything was thought out. Whereas opposed to, George R.R. Martin, you have, don't get me wrong, still a very well crafted world, but it's very much more driven by the characters. Who are these characters? Who are these people? As opposed to it is, the actual Westeros. So with your world that you've crafted for When the Blood Has Dried, like how far did, I know you're a fantasy nerd like I am, so like how far did you really go with building out this world? And I mean, you have some really like interesting names and places, which obviously we don't get to all of that in the book, but do you know that, like, do you have a little Bible stashed away, like where Clonia is, or Ard Gorathon? Like, do you know where these places are? Are these kind of placeholder names and something to discover later?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a very good comparison. Like, like, not are you a pantser or an architect? Are you a Tolkien or a George R. R. Martin?
Yeah.
And I think that this week is Worldcon, the World Fantasy and Science Fiction Convention. So it's a fair question to ask. I suppose in terms of the world building of it all, it starts with the character, right? So in terms of that sense, I'm more like George R. R. Martin, not to compare myself in any way to that literary master, slow as he may be. But when we were approaching this series, when we were developing these series, so because like I said, the original idea of this story went back to about probably 2019. 2019 is when, having said to Daniel, look, if we want to work together on something, we want to work together on something longer. If I have a story or you have a story, come to the other and we'll work it. That's when the spark with the idea for When the Blood Has Dried came, and I went to Daniel. But we had spent a long time kind of working on the pitch document and the pitch process. So a lot of that we would have spent, I wrote, say, character profiles for Daniel about who the main cast were, what was their background, what was their motivations, their arcs, how do they relate to each other. So we did that, and then Daniel did a lot of designs of, what does the guild look like, what's the iconography, what's the symbol, things like that. So as for the specifics of, okay, what's Ardguian, where is Clonia, and things like that, I have answers to those. I know in the process of writing, we developed out and we worked on, okay, things like that, part of the broader world building to make, because it's what's important in a book like this is that it feels like a lived-in world. It can't feel like that this world came into existence 2 minutes before you opened the page. It has to feel like this is a world that is live, that things are going on, even if you don't see them. That there are other stories going on that you're not privy to. Now, the nature of When the Blood Has Dried is that it's really just set in one town. It's set in one small rural town, so you get to know the people of that town and its location, things like that, very, very well. It's the reason why in the first issue we give it a 2-page spread, and it's the only 2-page spread we actually do in the book, is to introduce you to this character of the town. But that was important. But it also is important given that these are characters with backstories. This is characters who are members of a guild and were part of this kind of broader adventuring circle, to touch on the world outside the town, to understand why the arrival of the guild as this corrupting influence on the town, on the corrupting influence of the outside, and of the kind of the broader political machinations that are going on outside of the town. Because we refer to the fact that there's a war going on, or that there's a war about to break out, that the guild are like this, paramilitaristic wing of the state, these kind of officially sanctioned mercenaries and things like that. So when it comes to what we need in the story, we would put in things like that. But before I put them in, I would know what they are. But they're not. But the whole point, or their importance, is that that they're not the story. They are flavor. They add to the depth. They demonstrate to you that there is a world outside the confines of Carrigan Vun, the town where this takes place in. But they're not what we're focused on. We're focusing on the characters, and we might, if this does extremely well, people pick it up and trade, and they like it. There are stories we could tell about those places. There are different corners of this world we could explore, but they're not things that are necessary for the reader to know in the moment in order for the story to work. Because ultimately, this is a character study, a conflict between Maeve and Darius, and the battle for the soul of this small town.
That is just so cool, dude. Like I said, I am such a big fantasy nerd, and the way that you describe, breaking that down is just, again, just so fascinating. And I love too how, again, like you don't spoon feed us like this world, right? Like we learn about it, like you said, in conversation. Like someone mentions Colonia or something like that, but you're not like, this place was here, blah, blah, blah. And I think that just adds to the intrigue of it all. And like you said, really investing you into the world. And I mean, again, to bring up, the example of Tolkien, like, when you're reading Lord of the Rings, like you don't know what Elendil's star is, or, all these kind of things. And it piques your interest. Like, what is that? What is all that? And I think that's just such a beautiful way to, like I said, invest the reader into the world, pique our interest with questions. Because I mean, when I finished this, I was just filled with questions. Like I want to know, again, where Colonia is, who's the queen, what's up with the rest of the guard, like all of these questions. I think you really nailed it on the head with not getting too lost in the world building, but also having enough there to, like you just said, make the world feel lived in, feel real. And that brings us to one of my last questions, which I wish I could have you. We're going to have to get you back, because I want to talk about this book all day long. But so this world, again, is just, I think, rich for storytelling. And I mean, I need more of my boy Fergus. That is my guy. I love Fergus. Yes. Like you said, we love a short king, and Fergus is my dude. So as of right now, like you said, obviously a lot of this depends on, people picking it up, which, again, I'm going to say it probably 5 more times before we end this, but everyone watching and listening to this, go out and pick up When the Blood Has Dried from MadCave issues 1 through 5. Hopefully we'll be getting a trade for that soon. But Gary, my man, is there any plans as of right now? Again, I know like you most likely have stories in mind, but is there any like hard plans of more stories in the When the Blood Is Dried world?
Yeah, so the final issue will be out on the 25th of August, and then the trade will be out the 19th of November. So there's all that kind of runway there. And if it does well and people really dig it, I hope that we'll be able to come back and explore different avenues of the world. I think it's important, for your listeners to know as well, is that this was always pitched as a 5-issue series. It was pitched, as a standalone novel, essentially. That there, at the end of this series, there is a satisfying conclusion for the characters. It might be a heartbreaking conclusion, it might be a conclusion that you might feel, conflicted about, but it was always designed as 5 issues. And there are broader machinations, there are different things we could explore, but that the story of Maeve and the story of her conflict with Darius would end in those 5 issues. One of the cool things we're doing for When the Blood Has Dried is that, particularly as we get closer to the trade, one of the kind of inspirations for When the Blood Has Dried was my first forays into playing Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role playing. So we are actually going alongside if you pick up the trade, but alongside that, we have a 5th edition supplement, a one-shot adventure that we're going to be releasing alongside that. So it's written by Anton Kramov, who's a game director and writer who's really, really talented guy, and we worked with him early on to kind of develop, because I wanted to pay tribute to that kind of origin, that kind of background to the book. And so we've kind of set up we've got a one-shot that'll come out alongside that, that you'll be able to access, and we'll kind of place you in the role of someone who, like Maeve, finds themselves at the mercy of the guild and has to work through that, and allows the readers to put the world of When the Blood Has Dried into their own D&D games and 5th edition compatible games and work with that. So that's what we have in the works at the moment. So we'll be able to talk about that a bit more down the line. Other than that, that's where we are. And as I said, if people like it and they support it, shout about it on Twitter, tell MadCave you'd like to see more, and most importantly, tell your local comic shop you'd like to see more, and hopefully you might be able to return to the Southern Territories and Carrigan Bun someday.
Well, I need it right now, so I'm gonna be emailing MadCave once we get off this call. But again, I'm gonna say it again. Everyone watching, listening, go to your comic shop, pick up issue 1 through 4 of When the Blood Has Dried, and then make sure to pick up issue 5, August 23rd, right? 21st, August 21st. Be sure to pick up issue 5. And like Gary said, and I will attest to this, it works so well in the 5 issues. And while I do want more of it, and I'm like craving for more of this world, it wraps itself up absolutely beautifully in the 5 issues, which again is a testament to how well I think you guys paced out these issues, because it works so well from beginning to end, as it's 5 kind of own issues. And so, again, I think you guys just knocked it out of the park with this. I am so excited for whatever you guys have cooking next, because you guys have a major fan in me. And so, I wish we had more time and we could talk all day about this stuff. But unfortunately, I know you're busy and I got to let you go. So I want to throw it off to you before we get out of here. Let the people know where to find you. If you got anything else you're working on, let us know what we can expect. And like I said, your time to let us know.
Yeah, so if social media is so weird at the moment. If you look for Gary Moloney on any of the kind of the major social media channels, Twitter, Instagram, you'll find me there. Blue Sky, I'm on that too. As for future projects, one of the current projects I'm working on at the moment is I'm doing the Irish language translations for Dan Scotty's Flash Gordon newspaper strip. So every week I do the Irish language version of that in conjunction with Lightning Strike Comics and the Tala Academy of Sequential Art. So that's something we're doing every single week. And there may be stuff coming up with that in the future that you should be paying attention to. So keep an eye out for those. The main thing for me coming out in the next while is that, as I mentioned earlier, my start off in comics was Limit Break Comics, which is the comic collective that I set up with Paul Carroll and Garrett Luby. We have done for a number of years mythology mashup anthologies. So we did Turning Roads, which was Irish folklore and science fiction. We did Down Below, which was Greek mythology and noir crime stories. And then we did Fractured Realms, which is Norse mythology and horror. So actually I must get you that, because I suspect that'd be very much in line with your interests.
I say you have all of them piqued my interest, but that one I'm going to be searching for that immediately.
Yeah, but we have a 4th one that we're going to be funding in Kickstarter in September. So it's called Wish Upon a Star, and it's going to be far future fairy tales. It's edited by myself and Paul Carroll. It's got a wonderful cover by Nathan Stockman and Deacon. And so if you follow Limit Break Comics on Twitter, or we have a newsletter as well, you can stay posted about that. The campaign page will be going up soon, and you can follow along to make sure that you're updated as to when that campaign starts. And as I said, we've done 3 of these, so we know how to produce them. We know together we've got collaborators from all over the world. It's going to be a good time. So hopefully people will pop along to that too.
You got me. I will definitely be along. That sounds absolutely fantastic. Everyone, again, watching, listening to this, be sure to go pick up When the Blood Is Dried. Go follow Gary and keep up to date with all the things he's got going on. Also, check the description of this video. I will be updating it for when that Kickstarter does go live. So if you're listening to this in the future, then you can just go right down and click the link. You don't even got to leave this video. But Gary,
The
I
future.
can exactly. Whoa. But Gary, I cannot thank you enough for coming and nerding out with me today. Like I said, it has been just an absolute pleasure talking to you. We're going to have to get you back on so we can talk more about When the Blood Is Dried and all these future projects you have going on. Everyone that is watching and listening to this, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you would, please consider giving us a like and subscribe. It really, really helps us out. And also be sure to go and follow us on all of our socials. Follow Agents of Fandom on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. Anywhere you get your news, you can find us there. And also make sure to follow Comic Corner on Twitter. And that is going to be all we have for you guys. Thank you so much for watching.